On the morning of June 28, 1914, the temperature in Sarajevo reached a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The city's residents prepared for the visit of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie. Street cleaners had worked through the night. Municipal officials had reviewed security arrangements. The route had been published in newspapers days in advance. A decision that would prove catastrophic, though no one recognized it at the time. What distinguishes this particular assassination from the hundreds of other political murders throughout history is not the act itself, but the astonishing series of contingencies that made it possible. The first assassination attempt that morning failed. The conspirators, a group of young Serbian nationalists, had scattered after throwing a bomb that bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded under the vehicle behind it. The royal couple survived. The day's official events could have been cancelled. The Archduke could have left Sarajevo immediately. Instead, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded from the bombing at the local hospital. This decision required a change to the published route. The new route was communicated to the Archduke and his security detail. It was not, however, effectively communicated to all the drivers in the motorcade. This communication failure is simple. Mundane administrative oversight created the conditions for one of history's most consequential moments. The story of World War I's beginning is not actually a story about grand historical forces colliding with inevitability. It is a story about a series of small, preventable mistakes compounding upon each other until they became irreversible. It is a story about a wrong turn. Historians have long described the Balkans in 1914 as a powder keg waiting to explode. This metaphor, while vivid, obscures a more complex reality. The region was certainly unstable, but instability alone does not produce world wars. The European continent had experienced numerous crises in the preceding decades: the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, the Agadir crisis, and each time, the great powers had found ways to step back from the brink. There was no historical inevitability to the events that followed Franz Ferdinand's assassination. What transformed a regional crisis into a global catastrophe was a specific combination of diplomatic rigidity, military planning that eliminated flexibility, and a series of decisions made under time pressure by men who believed they were acting defensively. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was, by 1914, an anachronism struggling to survive in an age of nationalism. The dual monarchy governed approximately 51 million people speaking at least 11 major languages and practicing multiple religions. Emperor Franz Joseph I, who had ruled since 1848, presided over a political structure that satisfied almost no one. The Hungarians resented sharing power with Austria. The Slavic populations, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, resented being governed by both. The German-speaking Austrians feared losing their dominant position as demographic trends shifted against them. Franz Ferdinand himself understood this existential challenge. Unlike the common portrayal of him as a warmonger, the Archduke had actually opposed military adventurism in the Balkans. His political vision involved transforming the dual monarchy into a triple monarchy, granting the South Slavs, including Serbs within the empire, a status equal to that of Austria and Hungary. This trialism was intended to address nationalist grievances through federal reform rather than repression. Ironically, this position made Franz Ferdinand a target for Serbian nationalists. A successful reform that satisfied South Slavs within the empire would undermine the dream of a greater Serbia that would unite all Serbs under Serbian rule. From the perspective of radical Serbian nationalists, Franz Ferdinand was not merely an enemy, he was the enemy because his potential success threatened their entire project. The organization behind the assassination plot was officially called Unification or Death, but it operated under the more evocative name Black Hand. Founded in 1911 by Serbian military officers, the Black Hand dedicated itself to creating a greater Serbia through violent means. Its leader was Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijevic, known by the code name Apis, who served as chief of Serbian military intelligence. This fact, that the head of Serbia's intelligence service also led a terrorist organization, would become crucial in the diplomatic aftermath of the assassination. The immediate conspirators were younger and more idealistic than their handlers. Gavrilo Princip, who would fire the fatal shots, was 19 years old. Nedeljko Vebernovia, who threw the bomb that failed to kill the Archduke, was 19. Trifko Grabec, another member of the assassination team, was 18. These were not hardened terrorists, but students and apprentices, radicalized by nationalist rhetoric and tuberculosis-driven fatalism. Princip, in particular, suffered from tuberculosis and likely did not expect to live much longer, regardless of the outcome of the assassination attempt. The Black Hand provided the young conspirators with weapons, training, and passage across the border from Serbia into Bosnia-Herzegovina, which Austria-Hungary had annexed in 1908 to widespread Serbian outrage. The weapons 4FN Model 1910 semi-automatic pistols and 6-hand grenades filled with shrapnel came from Serbian military arsenals. The training, though rudimentary, took place in Belgrade under the supervision of Black Hand operatives. The border crossing was facilitated by Serbian frontier guards who were either Black Hand members or sympathizers. These details would matter enormously in the coming weeks. Austria-Hungary would argue that Serbia bore state responsibility for the assassination because of the involvement of Serbian military personnel and resources. Serbia would argue that the Black Hand operated independently of the Serbian government, which was technically true. Prime Minister Nikola Pašić had actually learned of the plot and made a half-hearted attempt to warn Vienna through ambiguous diplomatic channels, though the warning was neither clear enough nor direct enough to be effective. The visit to Sarajevo on June 28 was not a political necessity. June 28 was Vidovdan, St. Vitus's Day, the most important date in the Serbian national calendar. It commemorated the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. When Serbian forces were defeated by the Ottoman Empire, defeat that Serbs viewed as a tragic but heroic moment of national sacrifice. Choosing this specific date for a state visit to Bosnia-Herzegovina, with its large Serbian population, demonstrated either remarkable political insensitivity or deliberate provocation. Franz Ferdinand had his own reasons for the timing. June 28, 1914, was also his 14th wedding anniversary. He had married Sophie Chotak, a Czech countess, in 1900, against the wishes of Emperor Franz Joseph. Because Sophie was not of royal blood, she was denied the title of archduchess and their children were excluded from the line of succession. In Vienna, Sophie was subjected to constant humiliation in the rigid protocol of the imperial court. At state functions, she was seated separately from her husband, far down the table among lower-ranking nobility. But in Sarajevo, as the Archduke's wife accompanying him in his military capacity as Inspector General of the Army, Sophie could sit beside her husband in the official car, receive honors as his consort, and be treated with the dignity that was denied her in the capital. This personal motivation, the simple desire to spend his anniversary with his wife, treated as equals, contributed to Franz Ferdinand's insistence on maintaining the schedule of events even after the first assassination attempt. Security arrangements for the visit were, by modern standards, absurdly inadequate. Approximately 120 local policemen were assigned to crowd control along the route. There were no systematic background checks of people along the motorcade route. The cars were open-topped. The published route meant that anyone with violent intentions knew exactly where and when the Archduke would pass. Yet this level of security was not unusual for the period. The assumption that guided royal security was that the presence of the sovereign or their representatives among the people demonstrated strength and confidence. Heavy security suggested fear and weakness. After the morning's bomb attack, Count Franz von Herak, one of Franz Ferdinand's aides, suggested placing additional security on the running boards of the cars. The Archduke agreed. This precaution, had it been implemented properly, might have prevented what was to come. But the precise execution of this order became confused in the chaos following the bombing, and the additional security positions were not consistently maintained throughout the motorcade. The stage was now set. The conspirators had scattered after the failed bombing. Most had given up and gone home, assuming the mission had failed and that a massive security crackdown would follow. But Gavrilo Princip remained on the streets of Sarajevo. By chance, and only by chance, he positioned himself at the corner of Franz Joseph Street and Appel Quay, near Moritz Schiller's delicatessen. He was not lying in wait at a strategically chosen position. He simply happened to be there, probably contemplating his options, possibly considering whether to attempt another attack if an opportunity arose. The Archduke's motorcade was about to make a wrong turn, and Gavrilo Princip was standing at precisely the location where the driver would realize the mistake and stop to reverse direction. At approximately 10:45 a.m., after the bombing attack on the Appel Quay, Franz Ferdinand's motorcade arrived at Sarajevo City Hall for the planned reception. The Archduke was visibly shaken and angry. According to witnesses, his first words upon entering the building were directed at Sarajevo's mayor, Fehim Kirci, who had begun reading his prepared welcoming speech. "Mr. Mayor, I came here on a visit and I get bombs thrown at me. It is outrageous." The mayor, reportedly confused and still reading from his script, continued his welcoming remarks until someone whispered to him what had happened. The situation was unprecedented. No one in the official party had clear protocols for how to proceed after a failed assassination attempt. The gathering included military officers, local officials, and members of the Archduke's entourage, but no single authority took command of the security situation. Sophie, the Duchess, intervened. According to multiple accounts, she was the voice of calm reason. She suggested that they should visit the wounded officers from the explosion, Lieutenant Colonel Erich von Maritzi, who had been seriously injured, and several others who had been struck by bomb fragments. Franz Ferdinand agreed immediately. This decision was simultaneously humane and tactically unwise. It demonstrated concern for his soldiers, which aligned with Franz Ferdinand's genuine care for military welfare. But it meant staying in Sarajevo longer and traveling through streets where the remaining conspirators might still be positioned. General Oskar Podgoric, the governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina, who was responsible for security during the visit, made a crucial suggestion. The motorcade should avoid the narrow side streets of the original route and instead travel at high speed directly along the Appel Quay to the hospital. The Appel Quay was a wide, open boulevard running along the Miljaska River, harder for an attacker to approach and easier for the cars to maintain speed. This was sound tactical thinking. The decision was made quickly in the chaos and emotion following the bombing. The new route was communicated to Franz Ferdinand, to Sophie, to the security detail, and to the leading vehicles in the motorcade. What happened next remains one of the critical failures in a day filled with failures. The change of route was not clearly communicated to all drivers, particularly not to Leopold Loika, the driver of the Archduke's car. Leopold Loika was an experienced driver, a court chauffeur who had driven for the imperial family on numerous occasions. He was competent and professional. He was also operating under the information he had been given before the morning's events. Follow the original published route through the city to the museum, which required turning right off the Appel Quay onto Franz Joseph Street. The nature of the communication failure remains debated among historians, but the most probable explanation involves the chain of command. Count Franz von Harrach, who had assumed responsibility for security coordination after the bombing, believed he had communicated the route change to all necessary parties. General Podgoric, riding in the Archduke's car, also believed the drivers had been informed. But in the confusion with multiple conversations happening simultaneously, with people in various states of shock or anger, with no written orders distributed, the message did not reach Loika with sufficient clarity. This was not an exotic failure of communication involving complex technology or translation between languages. Everyone involved spoke German. The distance between the officials making decisions and the drivers who needed to implement them was measured in meters, not kilometers. The failure was purely organizational, a breakdown in the mundane but essential process of ensuring that operational instructions reach all personnel who need them. At approximately 10:50 a.m., the motorcade prepared to depart City Hall for the hospital. The order of vehicles had been modified after the bombing. The lead car now carried several police officers. The second car carried the mayor and the chief of police. The third car, the Archduke's Graf and Stift double phaeton, carried Franz Ferdinand and Sophie in the rear seats, General Podgoric and Count Harrach as security, and Leopold Loika driving. Count Harrach positioned himself on the left running board of the car, standing on the vehicle's exterior to provide a physical barrier between any potential attacker on the sidewalk and the Archduke. This was the enhanced security measure that had been discussed after the bombing. Harrach's position would become tragically significant. He blocked the left side of the vehicle, the side facing the crowds and buildings along most of the Appel Quay. This positioning assumed that any subsequent attack would come from the same side of the street as the morning's bombing. The motorcade began moving at speed along the Appel Quay. Gavrilo Princip, at this moment, was not in position to attack. After the failed bombing, he had walked away from his original position near the Kamerja Bridge. Other conspirators had similarly dispersed. Princip later testified that he had wandered somewhat aimlessly through the streets, unsure whether to continue waiting for another opportunity or to flee the city before the inevitable security sweep. By chance, and historians continue to debate whether chance is the right word or whether Princip retained some tactical awareness of possible routes he found himself outside Moritz Schiller's delicatessen at the corner of Franz Joseph Street and the Appel Quay. He was not lying in ambush. He was simply there, possibly buying food, possibly just standing on the street corner. The motorcade traveled at approximately 30 to 40 kilometers per hour along the Appel Quay. The lead vehicles passed the intersection with Franz Joseph Street without incident. The Archduke's car approached the same intersection. According to the original published route, the motorcade was supposed to turn right here onto Franz Joseph Street, proceed to the Latin Bridge, cross it, and continue to the museum. Leopold Loika, the driver, acting on the last clear instructions he had received, the original route began to turn right onto Franz Joseph Street. General Podiorik, sitting in the front passenger seat of the Archduke's car, realized the error immediately. According to multiple witness accounts, he shouted, "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight along the Appel Quay." The moment of realization unfolded across several seconds. Loika, hearing the general's shout, understood that he had made a mistake. The car had already begun the turn, the front wheels were turned, the vehicle's momentum was carrying it to the right onto Franz Joseph Street. But Loika was an experienced driver. The appropriate response to realizing he was on the wrong route was clear: stop the vehicle, reverse out of the turn, and proceed straight along the Appel Quay as intended. Loika applied the brakes. The Grafenstift came to a stop. The vehicle had stopped directly in front of Moritz Schiller's delicatessen, approximately 5 feet from where Gavrilo Princip was standing. Multiple witnesses later described the expression on Gavrilo Princip's face when he recognized the Archduke's car stopped in front of him. Some described surprise, others described determination. Princip himself, in later testimony, said he experienced a moment of disbelief that after the failed bombing and his aimless wandering, the target of the assassination plot had been delivered directly to him, felt like divine providence or historical destiny. The assassination had been designed as a group operation with multiple attackers positioned along a known route, ensuring that if one conspirator failed, others would have opportunities. The morning's bombing had destroyed this coordinated plan. The conspirators had scattered. The revised route should have taken the Archduke along a path where no assassins remained in position. But the wrong turn created a scenario that no one had planned: a single assassin, alone, presented with a stationary target at point-blank range. The time during which the car remained stopped from when Loika applied the brakes until Princip fired was probably between 4 and 7 seconds. Witnesses provided varying estimates, and human perception of time during extreme events is notoriously unreliable. But the best reconstruction based on physical evidence and multiple testimonies suggests this brief window. Gavrilo Princip drew his FM model 1910 pistol. This weapon was a semi-automatic pistol chambered in .380 ACP, 917 mm, firing a relatively small round at low velocity compared to military rifles. It held 7 rounds in the magazine, plus 1 in the chamber. It was designed as a concealed carry weapon for police and civilian self-defense, not as an assassination weapon. The Black Hand had provided these pistols because they were available from Serbian military stockpiles and were small enough to hide in clothing. Princip stepped forward from the sidewalk. Count Harek, standing on the left running board of the car, was positioned on the wrong side to intercept. The car's rightward turn meant that Princip approached from the right side of the vehicle, where there was no human shield between him and his targets. Princip raised the pistol. Multiple witnesses later testified that he aimed deliberately, took a moment to steady his hand, and fired twice in quick succession. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen, penetrating her stomach. Both shots were fired from a distance of approximately 4 to 5 feet. The wounds were immediately catastrophic, but not instantly fatal. Franz Ferdinand remained conscious for several minutes. According to Count Harek's testimony, the Archduke's first concern was for his wife. He called out, "Sophie! Sophie! Don't die! Stay alive for our children!" Sophie had collapsed against him and lost consciousness almost immediately. She died before the car reached the governor's residence, approximately 10 minutes after being shot. Franz Ferdinand survived slightly longer. As the car rushed toward medical help, he repeated, according to multiple witnesses, it is nothing, perhaps trying to reassure himself or others, perhaps experiencing shock that prevented full awareness of his injury. He lost consciousness and died at approximately 11:30 a.m., roughly 30 to 35 minutes after being shot. Leopold Loika, the driver, realized what had happened only when General Podgoric shouted at him to drive immediately to the governor's residence. Loika later testified that he felt overwhelming guilt for having made the wrong turn, though he was never officially blamed for the error. He survived World War I but carried the psychological weight of the moment for the rest of his life. Gavrilo Princip attempted to turn his weapon on himself after firing the shots, but he was tackled by bystanders and police before he could complete the suicide. A mob formed around him, and several witnesses reported that he was severely beaten before police took him into custody. He swallowed a cyanide capsule that the Black Hand had provided, but the poison was old and degraded. It induced severe vomiting but did not kill him. Princip, along with the other captured conspirators, was imprisoned and put on trial in October 1914 because he was 19 years old at the time of the assassination, 3 weeks short of the 20-year-old threshold for capital punishment under Austro-Hungarian law. He could not be sentenced to death. Instead, he received the maximum sentence for a minor, 20 years of hard labor. He was imprisoned in the Zienstadt fortress in Bohemia, where conditions were deliberately harsh. Princip, already suffering from tuberculosis before the assassination, deteriorated rapidly. His health declined further when prison doctors amputated his arm due to tuberculosis of the bone. He died on April 28, 1918, at age 23, weighing approximately 40 kilograms, 88 pounds. Less than 4 months before Austria-Hungary's collapse ended the war he had inadvertently started. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, did not immediately trigger World War I. The path from individual murder to continental catastrophe took 5 weeks and involved a series of calculated decisions by multiple governments, each believing they were acting rationally within their strategic constraints. Emperor Franz Joseph. I received news of his nephew's death while at his summer residence at Bad Ischl. His initial response was notably cold. Franz Joseph and Franz Ferdinand had maintained a distant relationship, strained by the latter's morganatic marriage and political views. The emperor's reported comment was, "A higher power has restored that order which I unfortunately was unable to maintain." This referred to the resolution of the succession question. Franz Ferdinand's children, excluded from succession, were now irrelevant, and the line would pass instead to Franz Joseph's grandnephew, Archduke Charles. But personal grief or lack thereof was irrelevant to the political calculation. The Austro-Hungarian government, led by Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold and Chief of the General Staff Franz Conrad von Hetzendorf, saw the assassination as an opportunity rather than merely a tragedy. For years, this faction had argued that Serbia represented an existential threat to the empire's integrity and that a preventive war was necessary to eliminate Serbian nationalism before it further destabilized Austria-Hungary's South Slav populations. The critical question was Germany. Austria-Hungary could not risk war with Serbia if Russia came to Serbia's defense, unless Germany guaranteed support. On July 5, 1914, Austrian envoys met with Kaiser Wilhelm II in Potsdam. The Kaiser, after consulting with Chancellor Theobald von Dettmann-Hallwig, issued what became known as the blank check, a guarantee of German support for whatever action Austria-Hungary decided to take against Serbia, even if it meant war with Russia. Wilhelm II's decision reflected a strategic calculation rooted in Germany's evolving military doctrine. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for a two-front war against France and Russia, assumed that Russia's mobilization would be slow due to the vast distances and poor infrastructure of the Russian Empire. If war was inevitable, and many German military leaders believed it was, then better to fight before Russia completed its ongoing military modernization. The assassination provided a justification that might never come again. Austria-Hungary spent 3 weeks preparing its response, deliberately delaying to allow international attention to drift away from the assassination, and to complete harvest operations that would be interrupted by military mobilization. On July 23, 1914, the Austro-Hungarian government presented Serbia with an ultimatum containing 10 demands. The demands were carefully constructed. Some were reasonable suppression of anti-Austrian propaganda, dismissal of military officers involved in nationalist agitation, judicial proceedings against conspirators. Others were deliberately unacceptable, particularly Point 6, which demanded that Austro-Hungarian officials be allowed to participate in the Serbian investigation and suppression of subversive movements on Serbian soil. This provision directly violated Serbian sovereignty and was designed to be rejected. The ultimatum included a 48-hour deadline for acceptance of all terms. This compressed timeframe eliminated room for negotiation or diplomatic maneuvering. It was not designed to resolve a crisis. It was designed to justify a war. Serbia's response, delivered on July 25, accepted 8 of the 10 demands outright and offered to submit the remaining points to international arbitration. By normal diplomatic standards, this was an extraordinary concession. But Austria-Hungary had not issued the ultimatum seeking concessions, it sought war. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. What followed was determined less by human decision-making than by the mechanical requirements of mobilization timetables and war plans that had been developed over decades. This is where the assassination's wrong turn transformed from a bilateral crisis into a world war. Russia, Serbia's patron, faced a strategic dilemma. Allowing Austria-Hungary to destroy Serbia would eliminate Russian influence in the Balkans and demonstrate weakness that might encourage further challenges to Russian interests. But Russian military doctrine held that partial mobilization deploying forces only against Austria-Hungary while leaving the German border undefended was operationally impossible. The Russian railway system and mobilization plans were designed for full mobilization or none at all. On July 30, 1914, Tsar Nicholas II ordered full Russian mobilization. This decision was perhaps the single most consequential act of the July crisis, because it activated Germany's war plan. The Schlieffen Plan required Germany to defeat France quickly before Russia could fully mobilize, then turn east to fight Russia with all forces. Russian mobilization meant the window for executing this plan was closing. German military leaders, particularly Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, believed correctly that delay would be fatal to German prospects in a two-front war. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914. The Schlieffen Plan required invading France through Belgium to bypass France's heavily fortified eastern border. Belgium's neutrality was guaranteed by treaty, including by Britain. When Germany demanded passage through Belgium, and Belgium refused, Germany invaded anyway on August 3. This invasion activated Britain's commitment to Belgian neutrality. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. A local Balkan crisis had metastasized into a general European war involving all the great powers. The numbers that emerged from this chain of events, triggered by a wrong turn at a Sarajevo intersection, remain almost incomprehensible. Military deaths. Approximately 9 to 11 million soldiers died during World War I. The exact figure remains disputed because many bodies were never recovered or identified, and casualty record-keeping varied dramatically between nations and over time. Civilian deaths. Approximately 7 to 8 million civilians died from war-related causes, starvation, disease, genocide, and direct military action. This figure includes the Armenian genocide, 1915 to 1917, which killed approximately 1.5 million people, and the Spanish flu pandemic, 1918 to 1919, which killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people globally, with the war's troop movements and crowded conditions significantly accelerating its spread. Economic destruction. The war cost the participating nations approximately $208 billion and $1,918, equivalent to approximately $3.7 trillion in 2024 dollars. This figure accounts only for direct costs, not the value of destroyed property, lost productivity, or long-term economic disruption. But these numbers, while staggering, understate the complete historical impact. World War I destroyed 4 empires: the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian empires. It created the conditions for the Bolshevik Revolution, which established the Soviet Union and shaped the entire 20th century. It imposed the Treaty of Versailles, whose punitive terms against Germany created economic and political instability that enabled the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. World War II, which killed between 70 and 85 million people, emerged directly from the unresolved tensions and imposed settlements of World War I. The Holocaust, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cold War, the decolonization conflicts, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. The chain of causation extends across the entire century and beyond. Historical counterfactuals are inherently speculative, but the question demands consideration. What if Leopold Loika had been clearly informed of the route change? What if he had continued straight along the Appel Quay instead of turning onto Franz Joseph Street? The most probable scenario is that Franz Ferdinand and Sophie would have reached the hospital safely, visited the wounded officers, and departed Sarajevo that afternoon alive. The assassination plot would have failed completely. Gavrilo Princip would have remained an unknown radical. The Black Hands operation would have been exposed as ineffective and amateurish. Would this have prevented World War I entirely? The historical consensus is uncertain. The structural tensions that made Europe vulnerable to a general war, the alliance systems, the arms races, the military doctrines that prioritized offense and rapid mobilization, the imperial competitions, the nationalist movements would have remained. Another crisis could have triggered the same cascade of mobilizations. But timing matters enormously in history. The specific crisis of July 1914 succeeded in producing a general war partly because of its unique characteristics. A clear violation, assassination, that created moral justification for action. A patron-client relationship, Russia-Serbia, that activated alliance commitments. A military doctrine, Schlieffen Plan, that required immediate action when mobilization began, and a set of leaders who believed war was manageable and perhaps even necessary. A different crisis at a different time might not have aligned these factors so catastrophically. The two Moroccan crises and the Balkan Wars had been resolved through diplomacy precisely because they did not create this particular combination of moral justification, alliance activation, and military urgency. Today, visitors to Sarajevo can stand at the corner of Zeleni Bareki Street, formerly Franz Joseph Street, and Obala Kalina Bana, the renamed Apolki. A small museum occupies part of the building where Moritz Schiller's delicatessen once stood. Footprints are embedded in the pavement marking where Gavrilo Princip stood when he fired. The physical distance involved in the wrong turn was approximately 50 meters, the distance. Loika's car traveled from where it should have continued straight to where it actually stopped. This 50-meter deviation, taking perhaps 4 to 5 seconds to traverse, created the conditions for 2 gunshots that killed 2 people and triggered a chain of events that killed tens of millions. The error was banal a communication failure in a confused situation. A driver following his last clear instructions, an official assuming that instructions had been conveyed when they had not. There was no grand conspiracy, no dramatic failure of intelligence, no betrayal. Just a mundane organizational mistake of the type that occurs thousands of times daily in complex operations worldwide. Most such mistakes have no consequences beyond minor inefficiency or embarrassment. This one changed the course of human history. The lesson, if there is one, is not about the inevitability of historical forces or the powerlessness of individuals. It is about fragility, how complex systems can be catastrophically vulnerable to small perturbations, how the consequences of error can cascade far beyond any reasonable scale, how what seems in the moment like a minor correction to a driving route can echo across generations. Leopold Loika, the driver who made the wrong turn, lived until 1926. He never fully recovered from the psychological burden of his role in the day's events. In his final years, he reportedly told people that he had driven the world into war. This was not literally true. He was one small actor in a vast drama shaped by imperial ambitions, nationalist fervor, military doctrines, and diplomatic failures. But in another sense, for those 4 seconds when his car was stopped at a Sarajevo intersection, with an assassin 5 feet away and no security position to intervene, the fate of millions hung on his wrong turn.